In this lesson, we're going to learn about object tracking pre-production and take more of a lecture style look at what object tracking in MatchMover is and what we can do with it, as well as its limitations. So again, this lesson is not really going to be we're working on anything, but we're just going to talk about object tracking. So if you want to jump right in and start tracking and get working, you can jump to the next lesson. But if you want to do your own shoot, I heavily recommend continuing this lesson. Okay, so in the beginning, what is object tracking? Well, object tracking is taking something that is a static or a sort of a fixed object. So this picture frame is not moving, it's not bendable, it's not sort of flapping in the wind. It's just a very static object. And what we can do is MatchMover can track this object, and then we can solve a camera for this object. Now our camera is actually, in the real world, is moving slightly. However, what MatchMover can do is it can solve a camera as if this object was a 3D scene that is moving around. Now, what is the point of that, you might ask? Well, we can now add in 3D objects to that scene around that object. So this is what we're going to be doing in this course, is we're going to be taking or tracking our picture frame, and then we're going to be using or rendering out a 3D object inside of that picture frame. So the requirements for your object is it needs to be a fixed object. So you couldn't do this with a bendy piece of paper or anything that moved too much or deformed. So what you need is some sort of fixed object. So in this case we use a picture frame, but object tracking is also often used for 3D replacement of things like guns or swords. For example, we could do an object track with something like a hammer and replace it with a CG sword. And another important part of object tracking is that your object needs to have things that help you track, or markers. In this case, we have markers on the base of the object as well as markers at various depths. You can notice we have 3 depths available in this shot. We have one depth at the very back, one depth halfway between or closer to us and the camera, and then finally another depth that is even closer to the camera. If we were to track these 4 objects, we would have a much worse track than when we track all of these various depths. So when choosing your object, make sure that you have various depths inside of your object or on your object, and you may need to sort of glue or tape things onto your object so that it has various depths. For example, on this hammer, we would probably want to add some sort of small object that is jutting out of this hammer to capture the depth information more reliably. So let me just walk you through a quick thought process that led to this shoot. We began just with a normal picture frame. However, the reflections caused us a lot of problems. As you can see here, MatchMover would have a really difficult time trying to track these things with all of these varying reflections going on. So next we tracked one without the plate glass and with just a green back screen. Now I used a green back screen because it's very easy to key out, and this is going to help us later when we need to layer objects in front of our background or in front of our CG. For example, we would have much more trouble extracting out this thumb here if the background was not green. However, the problem with this one was we have too many trackers, or in other words, we have a lot of cleanup work to do. When you're placing these trackers, make sure that you place them in the right place or the correct place, and if you can place them only in areas that you're going to replace or edit, that will be best. For example, if we used this shot, we would need to go into our compositing application and edit out or remove all of these tracker points. So finally, that leads us to our eventual shoot where we have tracker points only in areas that we're going to replace, as well as trackers on varying levels of depth. If you find that you're doing an object tracking and MatchMover is unable to track it, it is probably because you do not have enough depth in between your various tracker points. MatchMover is incredibly reliant on trackers of multiple depths. In this case, we have 3 different depths in our shot, and that lets MatchMover solve our track very nicely. Okay, so to just recap, to track an object with Match Mover, that object needs to be fixed. In other words, it cannot deform. We cannot track something like a pillow or a piece of paper that's blowing in the wind. That would not work well at all, because Match Mover needs to assume that whatever it's tracking, the points are fixed in relation to each other. We also, as I said before, need tracks at various depths. So that might mean adding pieces of geometry or adding parts to your object that weren't there before, so you can have depths in your shot so that Match Mover can solve them. And lastly, try to minimize any difficult work later on by keeping your tracker points in the areas that you're going to remove, as well as minimizing difficult things like light changing or reflections. Okay, so now that we have talked a little bit about what object tracking is and how to do it, to now jump into Match Mover on our first step to creating this pleasing final composition.